Hey guys, it's Daniel. The following is a clip from one of my interviews with Alice in Chains engineer Jonathan Plum. If you want to see the full interview, it's linked below. So, in addition to Alice in Chains, another band you work with at London Bridge Studios is Pearl Jam. How would you compare Layne Staley and Eddie Vedder as vocalists?
My era of working with them, again, this was the early 90s, and they were way in different places, because Layne and Alice had been a band for much, much longer, and I think had much more experience at that point than, Eddie did with Pearl Jam. I think Pearl Jam Stone and Jeff had a lot of recording experience, but I don't think Eddie did. So I think when I worked with them in the early 90s, Eddie was kind of a newbie. I started seeing the very beginnings of Eddie starting to break out more. But at that point, he was just there doing his job. He showed up and he wanted to do good and please everybody. So again, it was like he was in a different place in his career. He was, I think, still learning sort of the ropes of how recording goes. And his voice sounded amazing, but he wasn't like a performer like Layne. He couldn't, he could project and get that emotion, but technically, it wasn't always in key. Where I think Layne, at that era, in the early 90s, Layne was already completely refined, where I think it took Eddie another decade, well, maybe not a decade, but, a few more tours before his voice really got to the point where he was just on point all the time. I worked with Pearl Jam a couple times. It wasn't extensive, and it was all in the early stuff, up to Dirty Frank. I worked on that, and State of Love and Trust. I was huge fans of both those bands. I guess in my opinion is both of those singers are singing straight from the soul, and you feel it, and it's awesome. But I don't think it would hurt Eddie's feelings to say that Layne was more of a refined, trained singer. I just think he was. I happen to know Layne was a student of a couple famous Seattle vocal coaches, and I have no idea what Eddie's vocal instructions were. But I think Eddie was much more raw, where Layne treated his voice more like an instrument, where I think Eddie, there was just more of a unrefined quality to him.
Over the years listening to his recordings, do you think he's progressed as a singer?
Yes. I think that's sort of the arc of singers as they get better. I think there's a rawness in the early stuff that I think everyone loves, and as he's gotten better, but he's gotten older too, it's hard to say. Those young, I think the early years, it's just changed, It's now he's more mature and he's singing more maturely. I think back in the early stuff, it was more unbridled, just emotional screaming, basically. But it's different because I think Layne always had that. Layne could control it, He could get that emotional thing, but his instrument was so refined. So he was kind of singing this raw emotion through a really refined instrument, where I think Eddie had no refined instrument. It was just kind of chaotic. If that makes sense, I don't know. I wish I could explain that better, but I think you can hear just you can sense that just by listening to it. Eddie it was a little, I guess punk is the word. It's just more raw,
Hey guys, the following is a clip from the first interview I did with Jonathan Plum.
How would you compare, they're two totally different vocalists. How would you compare Eddie Vedder to Layne Staley?
I think Eddie was still sort of finding his voice in the band. It was a new band, and my sense was he was still finding his voice in general, and he was finding his voice in the band. So I think it took more work. My experience with recording Pearl Jam then was that Eddie had to do a lot of takes. We would do many takes, compile the best of, and I guess I'm trying to think now because I worked with them a couple times. It was all back in the day, but the second time they came back, he knew more what he wanted, and I could see that progression where he was. And I've been around enough artists, I've gotten to work with Brandi Carlile a lot over the years, and someone like her, I've worked with her when she was really young, and then I've worked with her a couple times since she's toured the world. And after they tour the world, musicians, they just come back a new artist, really. So, for example, with Brandi, the last time I worked with Brandi, she just, one take, it's done. When I first started working with her when she was really young, it was kind of a struggle. So that was my impression with Eddie, was that when I got to work with him, he was still figuring it out. And now later, and I know, I can listen to them play live. It's he knows exactly what he's doing now. Yeah. Where I think Layne was already there. When I worked with Layne back in the day, he already knew exactly what he was doing. And that's why he could pull off. He was doing those takes often just in one take.
So in general, from your experience, what was different about working with Pearl Jam and working with Alice in Chains?
The difference between working with Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains is I think both bands were at the same place of making major, career decisions with their bands because they both were launching at that time. So it was super intense for all the bands, both those bands. But Pearl Jam wasn't like, their atmosphere wasn't so like party, silly, goofy. It was much more business-like. But they didn't give me any, they didn't pay much more attention to me in any different way. Although I will say Mike McCready did. Mike McCready was the guy that like pulled me aside and asked me like how long I worked there and like kind of like got to know me a little bit. So that's how it stands out to me, is like Mike McCready was like that and Layne was like that. They were the two guys in both those bands that like actually it was interested in this young kid that was there basically to get them coffee or do whatever. And from what I know about history books too, it's like that was kind of the two different bands. You know, Pearl Jam was kind of more business minded. So it didn't seem like there wasn't like this goofy locker room vibe as much with Pearl Jam as it was with Alice in Chains. It was like it was a comedy show all the time.
So I guess Pearl Jam were more straightforward, so to speak?
They were much more professional and polite, but I wouldn't say they were any more interested in me. As again, I'm working for the studio. So when they show up to the studio, I'm the guy that they're going to see, and they're going to need stuff. They're going to need coffee. They're going to need to know where to put their amps or whatever. And what's interesting about that era of London Bridge, which is pretty unique, I guess no one really talks about this, but like most studios, even nowadays too, like if you're a big band, you go to a studio in LA, there's going to be runners, there's going to be techs, there's a whole infrastructure of how a studio is going to run. You know, there's a ladder, there's the runner who they don't even step into the control room. They're outside of the studio, but they're there to go get food and whatever. And then there's an assistant engineer, and then there's an engineer, and there's a producer, and it's a whole hierarchy. At London Bridge, there was none of that. It was me and whoever was producing. So like when it was Toby, it was me and Toby. So I was playing all these roles. I was the runner, I was the assistant engineer. And that's kind of like in LA, that's kind of unheard of, you know? And making, these are major label records we're making with like big budgets, but it was just Toby and I. So like if Toby needed coffee, I'd go get coffee. If Toby needed a microphone plugged in, I'd go plug that microphone in. If Toby had to take a break, I would be the one running the tape deck. So it was like really extraordinary for me because I was playing all these different roles. But it's pretty unusual. Like I could maybe imagine the band might be a little bit like frustrating for them because they're maybe used to having all this infrastructure. But at London Bridge, typically that stuff just wasn't there. But maybe that's what made the process special.
So in terms of special, aside from what we've already spoken about, do you have any special memories from your time working with either Pearl Jam or Alice in Chains?
I do have a really funny Mike Starr story. So actually, this is one of the first things I think, my very first encounter with Alice in Chains with Mike Starr. And this was SAP. So they'd already recorded most of the parts. And I didn't know anything. I just was there, you know. And Mike Starr shows up, and it was just Mike and I. And I remember, I think I helped him get his bass set up a little bit. And I was like, well, what are we doing today? And he's like, well, I got to play bass on a song that Jerry played bass on. And Jerry did a killer job. I'm totally happy with the bass part. But my mom, I know my mom's going to know that I didn't play bass on that, and she's going to be pissed. And so I just, for my mom's sake, I got to go back and re-record the bass part myself. So he basically replaced what Jerry, it was the same bass part, but Mike Starr just played it himself. And he explained it to me that like he was going to be guilty because his mom would find out. I just thought that was really funny.
That's hilarious. That's so cool.
But Mike Starr seemed to be, he was kind of like within the party kind of atmosphere as well.
And what about Sean Kinney? How was he like?
He was awesome. He was hilarious, and he'd walk in, he was just like a hurricane, you know. Sean was great. Really fun. But again, like from my perspective now, he wasn't like someone that really like got to know me. He just was funny. He was like a comedian, you know. It was basically like hanging out with like a stand-up comedian all day long.